We are so glad that you come to worship God this morning. Lord, as we've gathered around this table today, we are so happy to have all of our guests with us today. We want you to come back. We want you to feel at home. We want you to feel as if you are loved, because truly you are. You're loved by God, and you're loved by the members of this church. I want to recognize this morning a couple among us who's celebrating a very special anniversary. I always enjoy mentioning couples in our congregation who have been married for 50 years or longer. But occasionally, a couple rolls around who has greatly exceeded even that number, and I think they are always worthy of double honor. This coming week, Dick and Joyce Johnson will be celebrating their 72nd wedding anniversary. Dick and Joyce, would you stand? Are you here this morning? Would you stand for us? Dick and Joyce here. All right. Thank you, Dick and Joyce. We love this couple so much. They are good folks. They are from my neck of the woods. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for them. Now, I wouldn't have told you that 40 years ago when Coach Johnson was making me run all that much. But I'm grateful. I'm grateful for them so very much. Well, happy birthday, Westside. You didn't know, did you? In fact, we just let it slip by almost unnoticed. But this past July, the Westside Church of Christ turned 60 years old. The group that began this congregation initially met in July of 1959. Now, that's special to me because that's when I was born, the same month. I'm just wondering this morning, how many of you were here back when this congregation started? All of you who were at that meeting or who have been at Westside since it originally began, would you stand for us, please? All of you who are here today, who were here back when Westside started in July of 59. I know Richard Davis, and I've got, I'm sure, several others out here. Thank you so much to each one of you who have been so faithful in the legacy of this congregation. You may be seated. Thank you for your faithfulness throughout all of these years. I wonder about those individuals who began this congregation, some of whom you've seen this morning, and others such as Dr. and Mrs. A.R. Brown or Fenwell Garner and his family, and I'm sure many others. Do you think that they ever imagined that Westside would be a congregation of over 600, 700 people? Do you think they ever imagined that the congregation would ever have a yearly budget approaching $1 million, a large majority of that being used in mission work around the world and preaching of the gospel? Can you imagine how those folks, did they imagine the thousands upon thousands of lives that the Westside Church of Christ would touch over the next 60 years? Not just here in Searcy, but throughout the United States and throughout the world. There are not many places where you can go where the church is in existence where someone hasn't had a connection at some point to the Westside Church of Christ in Searcy, Arkansas. And I am so grateful for our heritage. But this morning I want to ask the question, what about the next 60 years? What about the next chapter in the Westside story? What is that chapter going to look like for us? Now, I think, first of all, there are a couple of assumptions that I need to dispel right off the bat. And the first assumption may be some of you who perhaps are a bit older might be thinking, well, it really doesn't matter to me because I'm not going to be here 60 years from now. Well, guess what? Neither am I. But it does matter to me, and it should matter to you. For you are leaving a legacy through your faithfulness and your acts of service today. And just as Westside today stands upon some broad shoulders of some of the people I've just mentioned, the Eddie Baggett's, the Ted Altmans, and many others, one day people are going to be standing upon your shoulders, and the legacy that we leave will have an effect upon people in years to come. Now, likewise, you may be a young person, and you may be a college student, and you're thinking, well, you know, I'm just here for a little while. I'm here for 3 or 4 years. Maybe you're like me and you're on the 6-year plan. And I'm not going to be around here forever. And I'm going to graduate and I'm going to head off to Dallas or to New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Seattle or somewhere in between. And I just don't have much of a say in that. And you would be mistaken. Because, once again, you as a student are leaving a legacy. You are like a piece of chalk that leaves a little part of itself, on everything it touches. You are leaving a part of yourself. Though you may graduate and move on, you will leave a part of yourself on the Westside Church of Christ. And you will be leaving a legacy. What will that legacy look like? So don't work on the assumption that you have no say in writing the next chapter at Westside. You certainly do. The second assumption is one that is very sobering. And that is, we should not assume that Westside will even be here in 60 years. We must not assume that this church, as we have known it, will even be here in 60 years. The Lord, the day of the Lord, could come. Peter writes in 2 Peter 3, verse 10, that the day of the Lord will come as a thief, in which the heavens and the elements shall be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. Seeing that this is the case, Peter said, what manner of person should you be in all holiness and godliness? 2 Peter 3:11. But secondly, as we were reminded in the Harding Lectureship last Sunday evening by David Young of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the numbers among churches of Christ in the United States are declining rapidly. Every week, a congregation of the Church of Christ closes its doors in the United States. Every week, a congregation of the Church of Christ closes its doors in the United States. And you may be saying to yourself this morning, well, certainly not this church. I mean, look at how many people are here. Around 600 or so, I'm sure. Look at the facilities that are here. Surely not this church. When I was a young preacher in my mid-20s, I accepted my second full-time preaching work. I had started out working with a congregation in a small rural community in southeast Arkansas, a small farming town where the only thing that was more prevalent than the rice was the mosquitoes. And when I was 27 years old, I took my second full-time work and I moved to the town of West Helena, Arkansas, right on the West Helena, right on the Mississippi River, a delta town. And I began working with the Richmond Hill Church of Christ in West Helena, Arkansas. That congregation had approximately 250 members. I stayed there for 5 years, enjoyed my work there. In fact, there are some of those former West Helena people who are members at Westside today, and I'm grateful for that. But over the years, through a variety of circumstances, some economic, some not, that congregation began to lose members. And it continued to lose members, and continued to lose members, and continued to lose members until about the year 2000 or so, the doors were locked. The building was sold to another religious group. What at one time had been a thriving, active church no longer existed in its previous form. And if you think that can't happen here, you are mistaken. It can happen, and it will happen. Churches are born, churches thrive, and churches die unless the church takes an active interest in sustaining the lifeblood of that congregation. And so I ask all of us this morning to give serious consideration to our role in writing the next chapter of the West Side story. And to do this, I want to go to a familiar Old Testament character by the name of Nehemiah. Now, we read about Nehemiah in the Old Testament book that bears his name. Nehemiah comes shortly before the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, if you want to be turning there. And let me tell you a little bit about this fascinating man, Nehemiah. He lived about 450 years before Jesus came to the earth. Nehemiah lived at a time when the Jewish people were beginning to return to their homeland after years in captivity. Prior to Nehemiah's life, the northern kingdom of Israel, followed by the southern kingdom of Judah, had fallen into captivity to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, respectively. And then, after a period of time, the Persian Empire arose and overcame the weakened Babylonian Empire. So now the Jews were under captivity to the Persians. But a Persian king by the name of Cyrus issued a decree that began allowing the Jewish people to return to their homeland. And so they began, a group led by a priest named Ezra, another group led by a man named Zerubbabel, and a group led by Zerubbabel actually began rebuilding the temple of God in Jerusalem. But the walls of Jerusalem that were defensive against the enemies of the people had never been reconstructed. And this was the disturbing news that reached Nehemiah. Now, there are three characteristics of this man I want you to see. And the first one was this: he was attentive. He was attentive. Nehemiah was serving in the court of a king by the name of Artaxerxes. In fact, his full name was Artaxerxes Longimanus. Longimanus actually meant long hands. Artaxerxes' long hands. And Nehemiah was serving as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes when he heard the word, the disturbing news, that even though some of his kinsmen, the Jews, had returned to Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem were still in shambles. And Nehemiah was concerned about that. I find it interesting that even though Nehemiah lived in a pleasant surrounding there in the king's palace, he had a prominent position as the king's cupbearer. There was no need in Nehemiah's life necessarily. Things were quite comfortable in that particular day and age for Nehemiah. He was respected by the king. And yet Nehemiah took note of what was happening in Jerusalem. And his countenance fell. Artaxerxes noted this and said, "What's wrong, Nehemiah?" And Nehemiah said, "How can I be comforted when the land of my forefathers lies in ruins?" not only did he hear about this, but he determined he had to do something about it. He was attentive. He was attentive. When he was presented with a need, he said, I have to do something. I cannot just sit here in the comfort of the king's palace, serving the king. I have to do something. What about you? When you hear of a need, what do you do? When a need is put before you that the church has, it may be the need for someone to assist in terms of physical activity, bodily presence. Do you turn your eyes away? Do you think, well, somebody else will do that? By the way, you've heard the story, haven't you, about the 4 guys? One was everybody, one was somebody, one was anybody, and one was nobody. There was a job to be done. Everybody thought somebody would do it. Somebody thought anybody could do it. Guess who did it? Nobody. Nobody did it. And then somebody got mad because everybody could have done it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody realized it was everybody's job, and it was ultimately nobody that did it. And so often it seems to me that when we're in a large group of people, we tend to think somebody else is the person that's going to step forward and do whatever the specific task is. That is the type of attitude of which dying churches are made. That's the type of attitude upon which churches that become corpse thrive. The attitude that somebody else will do it. The attitude that I don't have any responsibility. Let someone else do it. Nehemiah did not take that attitude. Rather, he was attentive. When the need came to him that the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed, Nehemiah realized he was somebody, and he had to do something. Now, not only was he attentive, number 2, he was assertive. He took action. He went to King Artaxerxes, and he asked for permission and provision so that he might return to Jerusalem, pardon me, so that he might go to Jerusalem to survey the situation. Artaxerxes was agreeable and gave Nehemiah papers for transit as well as provision to sustain both Nehemiah and those who would travel with him. He made the journey back to Jerusalem. And when he arrived at Jerusalem, the first thing he did was to go out at night and walk the perimeter of the city, where he noticed how the walls lay destroyed. They had been destroyed years earlier by the Babylonians, who had besieged the city and taken its residents captive, who had destroyed Solomon's splendorous temple. And as Nehemiah walked the perimeter of the city and he saw the stones of the wall laying in disarray, he determined that they had to be rebuilt for the defense of the people. And so he called together all of the people, all of the men of Jerusalem, and he asserted a plan to rebuild the walls. They organized themselves into contingents of workers, each contingent working on a specific section of that wall and the gates that were in that wall, and they began rebuilding it. I'm thankful that here was a man who had a can-do type of spirit, and he was assertive. He came up with a plan and he presented it to others. That's the type of person that can write a chapter in an ongoing story. You may be thinking, well, what can I do? How can I be assertive? Let me tell you about a young lady I met about a year ago. I'm a member of one of our civic clubs here in town. And one morning we had a young lady who goes to high school at Riverview, I believe it is, come and speak to us about a project that she had started. She had begun a project of taking shoe boxes and packing shoe boxes with small items of clothing, for children, along with items for personal hygiene, and even a little toy. All of this that could be rolled up compactly and stuffed into a shoebox of all things. And she had started doing this and sending it to underprivileged children in third world countries. Well, it wasn't long before she told some of her friends at school, right here in White County, about what she was doing. And her friends said, high schoolers, they said, we'd like to do that. Can we help? And so they all got together these shoe boxes and they just started packing them with these little items. And it wasn't long before somebody at school said, hey, as a school, we'd like to do this and help you. And before long, the whole school was doing this. And it wasn't long until word spread even further. And there were people from out of town who started calling and saying, could we get involved with this? Well, to make a long story short, by the time it was all said and done, they were sending over 10,000 shoeboxes to children, underprivileged kids in third world countries. A teenage girl with an idea who asserted herself and said, I can do this. Folks, if Westside is going to thrive, it's going to take people like that. People who don't sit back on a pew and wait for somebody else to do it. People who don't sit back and say, well, I just don't have much say around here. I'll just keep coming and warm my hind end on these pews and not do anything else. Thriving churches begin with people who take the initiative. That's what Nehemiah did. He was assertive. And third, I'm going to get preaching here in a minute. He was adamant. I mean, he didn't let anything deter him. Now, anytime you try to do something, there's always going to be somebody who's against it. There's always going to be somebody who tries to tear you down. Nehemiah had his critics. Some of the enemies of the Jews began criticizing him, saying, what these silly Jews are doing? Why, if a fox ran across it, it would fall down. Some of them came up and said, Nehemiah, meet us out in the plain so we can compromise. Nehemiah said, I'm too busy. I can't come down and talk to you. Some of them said, well, Nehemiah, we're going to bring our armies and we're going to attack you. Nehemiah told the people of Jerusalem, and they just simply set sentries up around the perimeter as they worked. There would be men working and there would be a soldier. There'd be men working and a soldier to defend themselves against any possible attacks. But here's the thing about it. Nehemiah said, we built the wall. He was adamant. He refused to allow intimidation, criticism, ridicule, or threats to deter him from the job that was at hand. And guess what? They built the wall. They completed the wall in 52 days. Not even 2 months. When was the last time you heard of any construction project being finished in less than 2 months? Why? Because the people had a mind to work, and because Nehemiah was attentive, assertive, and adamant. Now this morning, as I conclude, I want to tell you about a process that our elders are wanting all of us at Westside to participate in. This past summer, the shepherds of our congregation, along with those of us who are part of the ministry staff, began a process of evaluating and planning for the year 2020 and beyond in this congregation's history. What we have done thus far is we have tried to take a very prayerful and intense look at our strengths as a congregation and also at those areas that need improvement. The elders have set goals and been looking at goals in terms of areas of evangelism, education, edification, and equipping. And now, as they have been doing this process, they want to ask you as a congregation to become involved in that process. And here's how it's going to work. Throughout the month of October, we would like for every member of the Westside Church to complete a survey. It's very brief. It has just 3 questions to it. That survey can be completed in a short amount of time, and there are 2 different ways that you can do it. It can be completed online. Those of you who receive Westside emails, at 11:15 this morning, you're going to receive a link through your email to this survey form, and you can go to that survey and fill it out. For those who would prefer to do it on paper, there will be copies provided at the welcome desk. Now, we have all month to do this, but let me encourage you to go ahead and participate, because our elders want to know what you think as a congregation. What are our strengths? What areas do we need to improve in? What goals, what challenges do you see? What opportunities exist for us to be involved with as a body of God's people at this place? This is your opportunity to share your thoughts and your ideas, to become involved. So let me encourage you, whether it's by means of going online or whether it be by filling out one of the forms that will be at the welcome desk, take the time to make your thoughts known. All of us play a role in the next chapter of this West Side story. My prayer is that we will respond with the same courage, the same initiative, the attention, the assertiveness, and the adamant spirit that those individuals who started this church 60 years ago began with, and that 60 years from now, if the Lord allows this earth to continue to exist, people at the Westside Church of Christ will be standing steadfast and firm in the work of the Lord, and they'll look back and they'll say, you not only those people that started out in 1959, but those folks that were here in 2019 left a legacy of faithfulness. Now, where are you in your life today? Do you need to draw closer to God? Do you need to put Jesus on in repentance, confession, and baptism? Do you need to come back home to Him? If we can help you, please come while we stand and while we sing.